The inside of the bistro was always cold, but tonight it felt worse than usual. Maybe it was the marble floors that seemed to suck the heat right out of Hannah's shoes, or maybe it was just the way the people looked at her when she walked by. Hannah was 55 years old, with hair that used to be dark brown but was now mostly silver, tied back in a tight bun that pulled at her scalp. Her hands were her biggest source of shame these days. They were rough, red from the hot water and cleaning chemicals she used all day long, and the skin on her knuckles was cracked. No matter how much lotion she put on them at night, they looked like the hands of a woman who had spent a lifetime digging in the dirt, not the hands of the woman she used to be. She moved through the tables like a ghost. That was what she told herself. If you move quietly enough, and if you don't look anyone in the eye, you become invisible. It was a trick she had learned over the last 10 years, a survival skill. Back then, she used to be on the other side of the equation. She used to wear silk dresses and sit in soft chairs, sipping wine while discussing music theory. But life has a way of flipping tables when you aren't looking. Now, the silk was replaced by a cheap polyester uniform that scratched her neck, and the wine was replaced by the smell of fried garlic and bleach. The bistro was packed. It was a Friday night, which meant the critics were out. Hannah hated that word. In this city, being a critic didn't mean you knew anything about art or food. It just meant you had a smartphone with a good camera and an opinion louder than everyone else's. The room was filled with them men in tight suits and women with too much makeup, all trying to see who could be the loudest. Hannah was clearing a table near the large glass windows. She worked quickly, stacking the heavy ceramic plates. She could hear a group of men at the center table getting louder. Their laughter wasn't the happy kind, it was the sharp, barking laugh of people trying to prove they are the most important person in the room. The leader of the group was a man named David. Hannah knew his face, though she tried hard to avoid his table. He was a food influencer. He had thousands of people who watched him eat dinner on the internet. He was young, maybe 30, with a face that looked permanently surprised and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. David was leaning back in his chair, his arm draped over the empty seat next to him. He was complaining about the music. The bistro usually played soft, recorded jazz, something smooth and forgettable that just filled the silence. But tonight, David was in a mood to break things. "It is just noise," David said, his voice cutting through the clatter of silverware. "It is soulless. If I am paying $50 for a steak, I do not want to listen to a computer generate jazz. I want something real. Don't you agree, boys?" His friends nodded eagerly, like little birds waiting for a worm. They laughed at his joke, even though it wasn't funny. Hannah kept her head down. She wanted to grab the dirty dishes and run back to the kitchen, but she was stuck. The table was messy, and there was a spilled glass of water that she had to wipe up before she could move on. She got down on her knees, spraying the cleaner on the table leg, trying to make herself small. Then, the music stopped. The sound system had cut out, leaving the room in a sudden, awkward silence. The only sounds left were the clinking of forks and the low hum of the refrigerators. David snapped his fingers. The sound was sharp and loud, like a gunshot in the quiet room. "Perfect!" David yelled. "Now we can have some actual entertainment." Hannah froze. She was wiping up the water with a white rag. She felt a knot form in her stomach. She knew that tone. She had heard it before in schoolyards when she was a child, and she had heard it in fancy restaurants 10 years ago before she lost everything. It was the tone of a predator looking for prey. Her eyes flicked toward the corner of the room. there was a baby grand piano sitting there. It was a beautiful instrument, black and shiny. Mostly, it just sat there as a decoration. Sometimes, a hired player would come in on Thursdays, but not tonight. Tonight, it was just a piece of furniture. David turned in his chair, looking around the room to see who he could target. His eyes slid over the other servers, who were conveniently very busy elsewhere, and then they landed on the corner. Then, they shifted to Hannah, who was still kneeling by the table. "You," David said, pointing a finger at her. Hannah didn't move. Maybe if she pretended she didn't hear him, he would stop. "The lady in the uniform," David announced to the whole room. "You look like you have stories in your eyes. Get up." Hannah slowly stood up. She held the rag and the spray bottle in front of her like a shield. She looked at David, then quickly looked at his shoes. I am just clearing the table, sir. Can I get you anything else?" "I want music," David said. He swirled the ice in his glass. "See that piano, go play it." The table next to David's group went quiet. The people stopped chewing. They looked from the wealthy influencer to the tired waitress. This was the kind of awkward moment everyone hates, the kind where you want to look away but you can't. "I don't play," Hannah said softly. Her voice shook just a little. "I am a waitress. I work in the kitchen." "Liar!" David shouted, laughing. He wasn't really angry, he was just bored and cruel. He thought he was being funny. He thought he was the star of a movie and everyone else was just an actor. Everyone can play chopsticks. Come on. Don't be shy. It's just a bit of fun. Hannah felt the heat rising up her neck. She could feel 30 pairs of eyes burning into her skin. She looked toward the kitchen, hoping the manager would come out, but the kitchen was far away, separated by a heavy wall, and the chef wouldn't hear her. She was on her own. "Please," she whispered, clutching her rag tighter. "I have work to do." "Oh, come on," one of the other men at the table shouted. "Don't be a bore, lady. Give us a show." Then, someone else joined in. A woman from a nearby table, thinking she was being playful, clapped her hands. "Yeah. Play. Play." It started as a ripple. First David's table, then the table next to them. It wasn't a rhythmic clap yet, just a chaotic noise of encouragement. But David took control of it. He started slamming his hand on the table, a heavy, rhythmic beat. Thump. 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 Play. 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 The chant began. Hannah felt like she couldn't breathe. The room was spinning. The chant got louder. Play. 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 They didn't care about her. They didn't care about her feelings or her dignity. To them, she wasn't a person with a history. She was just a prop, a servant they could order around for their amusement. They wanted to see the old lady make a fool of herself. They wanted to laugh at her clumsy fingers so they could feel superior. She looked at David. He had his phone out now. He was holding it up, the black lens pointing right at her face. The little red light was blinking. He was recording this. This was going to be on the internet. The thought made her stomach turn over. She was going to be a meme. She was going to be the crazy waitress who thinks she can play. "Go on," David yelled over the noise. He stood up, walking toward her. He was tall and towered over her small frame. Unless you are too scared, are you telling me you have worked here for 10 years and never touched that piano? I haven't, Hannah said, her voice breaking. Please, sir. I need to work. Go sit down, he commanded, pointing to the piano bench. It's an order. If you play one song, I will give you $100 tip. If you are terrible, I will give you 200 just to stop. The room laughed. It was a cruel laugh. Hannah looked at the piano. It sat in the corner, looking lonely. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She knew what would happen if she sat down. She knew what would happen if she touched the keys. But the crowd was getting restless. The chanting was getting louder. Play. 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 She couldn't stand here and argue. She couldn't make a scene. If she caused a scene, the manager would fire her. She needed this job. She needed the paycheck to pay the rent next week. She looked at her hands, those rough, red hands. For a second, she wasn't in the bistro. She remembered a different time. She remembered a stage, bright lights, and a feeling of pure joy. She remembered fingers that flew across the keys without effort. But that was a lifetime ago. That person was dead. Sit. David shouted, losing his patience. He took a step closer, invading her personal space. Hannah flinched. She realized she had no way out. There was no rescue coming. The walls were closing in. The only way to make the noise stop was to give them what they wanted. She had to humiliate herself. She had to sit down and fumble through a nursery rhyme so they could laugh and go back to their dinners. Slowly, defeated, Hannah nodded her head. She put the spray bottle and the rag on the table she had just cleaned. Fine, she whispered, so quietly that no one heard it. She turned away from David. She walked across the room. The floor felt like it was made of mud, it was so hard to lift her feet. Every step felt heavy, like she was wearing lead shoes. The crowd parted for her, watching her like she was a strange animal in a zoo. As she walked, the chanting died down, replaced by a buzz of excited whispers. They were waiting for the show. She reached the piano. It smelled of lemon polish and old wood. It was a beautiful instrument, much nicer than anything she had owned in the past. She stood in front of the bench for a moment, looking down at the black and white keys. They seemed to stare back at her, mocking her. Hannah took a deep breath, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She adjusted her apron, smoothing out the wrinkles. She could feel the red light of David's phone camera burning into her back. She could feel the eyes of the room boring into her skull. She felt small. She felt dirty. She felt like a fraud. She lifted her right foot and placed it on the pedal. Then, she sat down. The bench was hard and cold. She felt the tears cling behind her eyes, but she forced them back. She would not cry. Not in front of them. She would not give them that satisfaction. She placed her hands in her lap. She squeezed her eyes shut for just a second, blocking out the chandeliers, the wine glasses, the expensive clothes, and the cruel smiles. She tried to find a quiet place in her mind, a place where David couldn't reach her. Then, she opened her eyes. She looked at the keys. She didn't know what she was going to play. She just knew she had to make a sound so the nightmare would end. She raised her shaking right hand and hovered it over the keyboard. The room went dead silent. This was the moment they were waiting for. The moment the joke would land. Hannah took one last breath, held it in her chest, and let her fingers drop. For a heartbeat, The only sound in the entire bistro was the sharp intake of breath from the people nearest to the piano. They were leaning in, elbows on tables, chins resting on hands, waiting for the comedy to start. They expected to hear a clumsy, thumping mistake. They wanted to hear a sour note that would make them laugh and feel superior. David, standing just a few feet away with his phone held high, had his finger hovering over the stop recording button, ready to capture what he thought would be the funniest part of his night. Hannah's right hand came down on the keys. It wasn't a mistake. She struck a C major chord, but she didn't just hit it, she leaned into it. Her weight went behind the keys, sinking deep into the mechanics of the instrument. The sound wasn't the tinny, weak plinking of a beginner. It was a deep, resonant boom that vibrated through the floorboards, up the piano legs, and into the bench. It was a sound that felt like a heavy door closing, shutting out the noise of the restaurant. Hannah didn't look at the crowd. She kept her eyes fixed on her hands. At first, she didn't even move her fingers. She just held that chord, letting the sound ring out and decay, listening to the vibration fade into the silence. It was a test. She was feeling the instrument, checking to see if it was in tune, checking to see if it had a soul. The piano responded. It had a warm, rich tone, surprisingly good for a restaurant instrument. It felt alive under her fingers. Slowly, almost painfully slowly, her left hand began to move. It crawled down the keyboard, playing low, rolling notes that sounded like thunder rumbling in the distance. It wasn't jazz. It wasn't the happy, upbeat pop music they played on the radio. It was heavy. It was classical, but not the fancy, fast kind that shows off how many notes you can play in a second. This was slow. It was serious. The room's atmosphere shifted instantly. The smiles froze on the faces of the diners. A man who was just about to take a bite of his steak stopped with the fork halfway to his mouth. The sound coming from the corner commanded respect. It wasn't background noise anymore, it was a presence that demanded to be heard. David took a step back. He lowered his phone slightly, a frown creasing his forehead. He looked at the screen, then at Hannah. This wasn't the awkward performance he had anticipated. There was a confidence in the way Hannah sat now. The slump was gone from her shoulders. Her back was straight, her posture rigid and elegant. It was as if someone had flipped a switch inside her. The tired, scared waitress was still there, hidden somewhere deep down, but the person sitting on the bench was a musician. Hannah's mind was racing, but her hands were calm. She hadn't planned to play this song. She hadn't planned to play anything specific. But the moment her fingers touched the ivory, her muscle memory took over. She was playing a piece she hadn't touched in a decade. It was a piece by Rachmaninoff, a composer known for being difficult and emotional. It was the music she had been practicing the night her world fell apart. She began to bring her right hand into the melody. The notes were simple at first, single, piercing tones that floated above the heavy bass line. They sounded like a voice crying out in the dark. The melody was heartbreaking. It wasn't just sad, it was the kind of music that makes you remember things you tried to forget. The critics at the tables started to look uncomfortable. One woman in a sparkling dress put down her wine glass. She looked at her husband, her eyes wide, as if to ask, "What is happening?" The laughter had died completely. No one was chewing anymore. The clatter of silverware had stopped. The only movement in the room was the gentle swaying of Hannah's body as she leaned into the music. Hannah didn't see them. In her mind, she wasn't in a bistro anymore. She was back in her old apartment, 30 years ago. The sun was streaming through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her husband was sitting in the armchair, reading a book. That was the memory attached to this melody. It was the memory of peace, of a time when life was simple and the future was bright. But as she played, the music began to change. The rhythm became unstable, the timing slightly off, not because of a lack of skill, but because of emotion. She was playing with the rubato, a stolen time where the music breathes and speeds up and slows down. The volume began to grow. Hannah pressed harder on the keys. Her rough fingers, usually so gentle with plates and glasses, became powerful weapons of expression. She struck the keys with a force that made the piano shudder. The music swelled, rising from a whisper to a roar. It was angry now. The melody twisted and turned, climbing higher and higher up the scale, sounding desperate. The complexity of the song was increasing. Her left hand was playing a fast, rolling wave of notes while her right hand leaped across the octaves. It was incredibly difficult music. A professional pianist would have struggled to make it sound this easy. Hannah's hands, despite being stiff and cold at the start, were now flying. They moved with a fluid grace that seemed impossible for a woman who spent her days scrubbing floors. David was now standing completely still. He had stopped recording. He was staring at Hannah's hands. He watched the way her fingers danced, independent of one another, the pinky flying out here, the thumb tucking under there. He noticed the calluses on her fingertips, the swollen joints, the veins that popped out on the back of her hands. He saw the physical toll her life had taken on her body, and then he saw the miracle of her overcoming it in real time. He felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightness that he usually only felt when he was in trouble. It was shame. It started as a small spark and began to grow. He looked around the room and saw the same look on everyone else's face. The mockery was gone. The arrogance had evaporated. They were realizing, one by one, that they had made a terrible mistake. They had tried to force a queen to act like a jester, and she had responded by showing them her crown. The music reached a climax. Hannah was playing chords that required her to stretch her hand wide, spanning nearly an octave and a half. The sound was massive, filling the high ceiling of the bistro, bouncing off the marble floors, and shaking the windows. It was a wall of sound that washed over the diners, cleansing the room of its pretension. For a moment, Hannah forgot where she was. She forgot about the rent she couldn't pay. She forgot about the pain in her lower back. She forgot about the insults. She was just the music. She was the vibration. For the first time in 10 years, she felt whole. She felt like herself. The tears she had been holding back finally broke free, but they didn't fall down her cheeks. They just welled in her eyes, blurring her vision, making the black and white keys look like a flowing river. Then, the music began to descend. The storm passed. The fast, angry notes slowed down. The volume dropped from a roar back to a whisper. The melody returned, but it was softer now, more fragile. It sounded like someone giving up, or perhaps someone accepting their fate. It was a resignation that was more beautiful than any victory. Hannah's hands slowed down. The chords became simpler. The gaps between the notes grew longer, allowing the silence to creep back in. She was playing the final phrases now. Each note was separated, hanging in the air like a drop of water before it falls. She played the final chord. It was a series of low, deep notes, spaced far apart. She held them for a long time, letting the pedal sustain the sound until it blended into a hum. She lifted her hands off the keys, but she didn't pull them away immediately. She let them hover just above the wood, as if she was saying goodbye to an old friend. Then, she lowered her hands to her lap. The bistro was plunged into a silence that was heavier than the one before. This wasn't the silence of waiting. This was the silence of shock. No one moved. No one breathed. Even the kitchen staff, who had peeked out through the service doors to watch, were frozen. Hannah sat there for a moment, staring at her lap. Her chest was heaving, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She could feel the blood rushing back into her face. Slowly, the reality of the situation began to creep back in. She remembered where she was. She remembered who she was supposed to be. She was just the waitress. The spell broke. Hannah quickly stood up, the scrape of the bench against the floor sounding like a gunshot in the quiet room. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at David. She turned and practically ran toward the sideboard where she had left her tray, desperate to grab her rag and spray bottle, desperate to hide. The silence stretched out, long and thin, like a wire pulled to its breaking point. It wasn't the polite silence that follows a speech, or the bored silence of a waiting room. It was heavy. It pressed down on the marble tables and hung in the air like a thick fog. No one knew what to do. The man who had been laughing the loudest earlier was now sitting with his mouth slightly open, his fork hovering in mid-air, forgotten. The woman in the sparkling dress had turned completely away from her date, her eyes wide and fixed on the empty space where the sound had been. Hannah felt like she couldn't breathe. The adrenaline that had fueled her fingers was gone, leaving her feeling shaky and hollow. She pushed herself up from the piano bench, her legs feeling weak under her. The sound of the bench scraping against the hard floor seemed incredibly loud in the quiet room, like a sudden crack of thunder that made people jump. She didn't look up. She couldn't. If she looked at them, she knew she would see the ridicule, or worse, the pity. She just wanted to disappear. She wanted to melt into the floorboards and become part of the restaurant's foundation, invisible and silent. She hurried toward the sideboard where she had left her spray bottle and rag. Her hands were trembling so badly that she almost knocked over an empty wine glass. She grabbed the cleaning supplies, clutching them to her chest like a shield. She felt exposed. For 10 minutes, she had bared her soul to a room full of strangers. She had shown them her grief, her history, and her love, and now she felt naked, standing there in her cheap uniform while they stared at her. David was still standing near the center table. He hadn't moved. His phone was dangling loosely in his hand, the screen dark. He was looking at the empty piano stool, then back at Hannah. The smirk was gone from his face. The arrogance that usually defined him had been wiped away, leaving a look that was confused and almost scared. He was trying to process what had just happened. He had prepared a video about a silly waitress. He had no idea how to edit the footage he had just recorded. The sound of her playing was still echoing in his ears, making his own thoughts feel petty and small. Hannah kept her head down as she moved through the room. She walked quickly, her eyes fixed on the swinging doors that led to the kitchen. She was almost there. She just had to get past the main floor. "Wait," a voice said. It wasn't loud, but it cut through the silence. It was a woman's voice, shaky and thin. Hannah didn't stop. She pretended she didn't hear it. She kept walking, her shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. She was just a few feet away from safety. "Please," the voice said, a little louder this time. "Don't go." It was the woman in the sparkling dress. She had stood up. Her hand was resting on her chest, right over her heart. Her eyes were wet with tears. She looked around the room at the other diners, as if asking for permission, and then she started to clap. It was a solitary sound at first. Clap. It sounded awkward in the quiet room. Hannah froze. Her hand was on the metal handle of the service door. She squeezed the cold metal, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to push through and run, but her feet felt like they were nailed to the floor. Then, a man at a table near the window stood up. He was older, wearing a suit that looked expensive but tired. He nodded at the woman and joined in. Clap. Clap. Slowly, the sound began to spread. It wasn't a wild roar or a cheer. It was slow, rhythmic, and respectful. One by one, people put down their napkins and stood up. Even the young men who were with David stood up, looking uncertain but following the crowd's lead. They weren't clapping because they were told to. They were clapping because they felt they had witnessed something real. In a world of fake smiles and filtered photos, Hannah had given them something raw and true. The applause grew, filling the room. It was a wall of sound that pushed back against the coldness Hannah had felt earlier. But Hannah didn't turn around. She squeezed her eyes shut tight. She didn't want their applause. She didn't want their validation. The music hadn't been for them. It had been for her, and for the ghost she carried in her heart. The clapping felt like it was violating a private moment. She pushed the handle of the door and slipped through the gap. The moment she stepped into the kitchen, the noise from the dining room changed. The heavy metal door swung shut behind her, cutting off the applause instantly. The temperature dropped. The smell of garlic and onions and stale grease washed over her, replacing the scent of expensive perfume. The kitchen was chaotic, as always. Pots were clanging, alarms were beeping, and the chefs were shouting orders. It was a stark contrast to the heavy silence she had just left. No one in here knew what had happened out there. To them, she was just Hannah, the lady who needed to clear table 4. She leaned back against the cool metal wall of the kitchen, letting out a long, shuddering breath. She looked down at her hands. They were still red and rough, the hands of a cleaner. But as she looked at them, she saw them differently. For 10 years, she had looked at these hands with resentment. She saw them as tools for survival, as symbols of her failure. But tonight, she saw them as instruments. They had still remembered. They had still been able to create beauty, even after everything. "Hannah! Where have you been?" the head chef yelled from the grill station. He was sweating, flipping burgers with a spatula. "Table 7 is waiting for their check." "Move it." "I'm coming," Hannah whispered. She wiped her eyes quickly with the back of her hand, making sure there were no tears. She took a deep breath, straightened her apron, and put her mask back on. She was the waitress again. She walked over to the order station, grabbed the check for table 7, and headed back toward the dining room. She hesitated for a second at the door. Her hand hovered over the handle. She was afraid to go back out there. She was afraid of what she would see on their faces. She pushed the door open and stepped out. The room was different. The atmosphere had completely shifted. The coldness was gone. The air felt warmer, softer. As Hannah walked across the floor, people stopped talking. They watched her. Not the way they watched her before, like she was furniture, but like she was a person. She walked past table 7. The couple sitting there didn't look at their phones. They looked at her. "That was beautiful," the man said quietly as Hannah placed the check on the table. Hannah just nodded. She didn't trust her voice to speak. She turned to walk away, but the woman reached out and gently touched Hannah's arm. Her hand was soft and manicured. "Thank you," the woman said. Her eyes were sincere. "Really?" Hannah gave a small, tight smile and pulled away gently. She kept moving. She felt like she was walking through a dream. As she passed the center table, she saw David. He was sitting down again. His phone was on the table, face down. He looked tired. He looked up as Hannah approached. He didn't smile. He didn't make a joke. He just looked at her, right in the eyes. For a second, Hannah saw a glimpse of the human being underneath the influencer persona. He looked ashamed. "I'm sorry," David said. His voice was low, almost a mumble. Hannah stopped. She looked at him. She waited for the punchline, for the trick, but it never came. He just looked down at his plate. Hannah didn't say anything. She didn't forgive him, and she didn't scold him. She just walked past him. She went to the piano in the corner. It was just a piece of furniture again, silent and still. The keys were still slightly warm from her touch. She ran her finger along the smooth wood edge of the instrument, a silent goodbye. She walked over to the sideboard to retrieve a water pitcher to refill tables. As she worked, refilling glasses and clearing plates, she realized that the invisible wall between her and the customers had shattered. They saw her now. They saw the woman, not just the uniform. A young man at a table near the window waved her over. He looked like he was a student, struggling to afford the expensive food. "Excuse me," he asked nervously. "Do you know the name of that piece you played?" Hannah looked at him. She thought for a moment. She hadn't thought about the name in years. It was just a feeling to her. "It was Rachmaninoff," she said softly. Her voice was raspy from the silence. "The E-flat major etude." The student nodded, writing it down on a napkin. "It was the best thing I've ever heard live," he said. Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the kitchen heat. She walked back to the service station, her step a little lighter than before. She caught the eye of the other waitress, a young girl named Lisa who usually ignored her. Lisa was standing by the wall, her mouth open in shock. "Hannah," Lisa whispered. "I didn't know you could do that." Hannah looked at the girl. She looked at her own rough hands, then back at the room full of people who were finally acting like human beings. "There's a lot you don't know, Lisa," Hannah said. She picked up a rag to wipe down a counter. She was just a waitress. She still had floors to scrub and dishes to wash. The rent was still due. But as she wiped the counter, moving her hand in a small, circular motion, she realized she wasn't carrying the same weight she had been carrying when she walked in. The music had let it out. She had played the song, and she had survived the listening. For the first time in 10 years, she felt like she could breathe. The kitchen was its usual noisy self, the clatter of pots and the hiss of the grill filling the air, but for Hannah, the noise felt different. It was no longer an annoying wall of sound that she had to block out. It was just background noise. Her mind was still humming with the quiet vibrations of the piano notes she had played. Her fingers felt strange, too. They tingled, as if the blood was rushing back into them after being asleep for a long time. She looked down at them as she grabbed a stack of clean napkins. They were still red and rough, the skin peeling slightly at the knuckles, but when she curled them into a fist, she didn't feel the ache she usually felt after a long shift. She felt power. She pushed through the swinging doors again to head back to the dining room. This time, she didn't hesitate. She held her head up a little higher than she had an hour ago. The change in the room was instant. It wasn't just that it was quiet, the atmosphere had changed from cold and hostile to something warm and heavy. It felt like the air after a rainstorm, cleared of all the dust and tension. The tables were mostly finished with their meals. People were lingering over coffee and dessert, talking in low voices. Before, they would have been on their phones, ignoring the world around them. Now, they were talking to each other. Some were even looking at the empty piano in the corner, as if it was a person who had just left the room. As Hannah walked past a large round table near the window, she saw a man wave her over. It was Mr. Sterling, a regular who came in 3 times a week. Hannah usually dreaded serving him. He was fussy, complained about the temperature of the water, and never, ever looked her in the eye. To him, she was just a mechanism that brought food. Tonight, when she stopped at his table, he didn't ask for more water. He didn't complain about the crumbs on the tablecloth. He was looking at her with a strange expression, his brow furrowed. For the first time in the 3 years she had served him, he actually made eye contact. "Hannah," he said. He read her name tag, stumbling over the pronunciation as if he had never said it before. "That piece you played, my mother used to play that when I was a child." Hannah stood still, holding her tray. "It is a beautiful piece," she said softly. "She passed away 5 years ago," Mr. Sterling continued. He looked down at his coffee cup, his voice dropping. "I haven't heard it played like that since her funeral. You captured something tonight. I don't know how to say it. You made me remember her properly. Not just the sadness, but who she was." Hannah felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say. This was the same man who had once snapped his fingers at her because she was too slow with the butter. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. "No," he said, shaking his head. "Thank you." He reached for his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill. He didn't just leave it on the table, he pressed it into Hannah's hand. "Please. Take it. It's not for the service. It's for the memory." Hannah looked at the bill, then at him. She wanted to refuse, to say it was too much, but the look in his eyes stopped her. He needed to give it. It was his way of closing a door. She nodded and slipped the bill into her apron pocket. She moved to the next table. A young couple was sitting there. The girl was crying quietly, using a napkin to wipe her eyes. The boy had his arm around her. When Hannah approached to clear their plates, the girl looked up. "I'm sorry," the girl sniffed. "I'm being silly. It's just I play the violin. I haven't touched it since I failed my audition last month. Hearing you play, seeing someone just do it because they love it, it made me realize I've been a coward." The girl reached out and touched Hannah's arm. "I'm going to go home and play tonight." "Thank you." Hannah felt a shock go through her. For years, she had felt invisible, just a background character in other people's lives. She thought her job was to serve them food, to stay out of the way. She never imagined that by doing something for herself, by stepping into that light for a few minutes, she could actually help them. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She was a mirror. They had seen their own pain and their own joy reflected in her music, and it had changed them. She worked her way around the room, clearing plates and pouring coffee. The dynamic had completely shifted. People weren't demanding things from her. They were treating her with a gentle respect. It was a respect she hadn't felt since she walked out of the conservatory all those years ago. Finally, she arrived at the center table. David. The man who had started it all. He was the only one who looked uncomfortable. His friends had left, mumbling excuses about early mornings, leaving him sitting alone with his half-finished steak. He didn't have his phone out anymore. It was sitting on the table, screen down. He looked smaller than he had earlier. The arrogance seemed to have drained out of him, leaving him slumped in his chair. Hannah walked up to the table. She didn't smile, but she didn't look away. She stood tall. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" she asked. Her voice was steady. David looked up. He looked tired. There were dark circles under his eyes. He looked at the empty piano, then back at Hannah. He started, then stopped. He rubbed his face with his hand. "I didn't know." Hannah waited. She didn't help him out. "I thought it would be funny," David admitted, his voice so low she almost had to lean in to hear him. "I wanted content. I wanted a laugh. I didn't know you were like that." He sighed, a long, heavy sigh that seemed to deflate him completely. "My sister plays," he said. "She's brilliant, but she quit because people told her she wasn't good enough. She works in an office now. She hates it. And I made fun of her for giving up." He looked at his hands, which were clasped on the table. "Watching you tonight, seeing you play like that, after whatever life you've lived, it made me feel like a piece of garbage. I upload videos making fun of people. You just played the truth. It's not even close." Hannah looked at him. She saw the shame rolling off him in waves. She realized that her performance hadn't just been a display of music, it had been a judgment. It was a judgment on his cynicism and his cruelty. And he had felt it. "We all make choices, David," Hannah said quietly. "You chose to be loud. I chose to be quiet for a long time. Tonight, I was just loud for a minute." David nodded slowly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a wad of cash. He didn't count it. He just placed it on the table, right under his unfinished glass of wine. It looked like a lot of money. "I'm not going to post the video," he said, looking at his phone. "I deleted it. It doesn't belong on the internet. It belongs in a concert hall." Hannah looked at the money, then at him. "That is too much." "Take it," he insisted. "Please. I need to pay for that seat. It was the best show I've ever seen." Hannah reached out and took the money. It was heavy in her hand. "Thank you." "No," David said, standing up slowly. "Thank you." He hesitated, then looked her in the eye. "I hope you play again. Not for us. For yourself." He turned and walked out of the restaurant, his hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had a lot to think about. Hannah stood there for a moment, holding the heavy stack of cash. She looked around the room. The bistro was emptying out now. The last of the diners were putting on their coats. As they walked past her, they nodded. Some smiled. Some just patted her shoulder gently. It wasn't a mob scene anymore, it was a quiet procession of people leaving a church. She realized something profound as she stood there. She had spent 10 years hiding her talent because she was afraid of being judged. She thought that if she played again, people would compare her to the woman she used to be, the young star with the bright future. She thought they would only see the mistakes, the rustiness, the age. But they didn't. They didn't see a failed prodigy. They saw a survivor. They saw the beauty of endurance. They saw that art isn't about being perfect or young or famous. It's about having something to say and the courage to say it. By trying to hide her past, she had been hiding the best part of herself. And tonight, by being forced to reveal it, she had finally reclaimed it. She picked up the heavy tray from the table, balancing it on her shoulder. It didn't feel heavy. Her back didn't hurt. She walked through the quiet room, turning out the dim lights on the tables as she went. She felt a sense of peace settle over her, a feeling that she hadn't felt since before the accident. She reached the piano one last time. It sat in the shadows now, the candle on the flickering out. Hannah reached out with her free hand and let her fingers rest on the cold keys for just a second. She didn't play a note. She just touched it, acknowledging that it was there, and that she was still there too. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, the swing doors waiting for her. She wasn't just going back to wash dishes. She was going back to her life. But it was a different life now. It was a life where she knew she still had a voice, even if it was just a whisper on a piano keys. And that made all the difference. The next morning arrived with the soft, gray light filtering through the curtains of Hannah's small apartment. Usually, she woke up with a groan, her back stiff and her mind already racing through the list of things she couldn't afford. But today, when she opened her eyes, she felt a strange sense of lightness. It wasn't that her problems had disappeared. The rent was still due, the refrigerator was still nearly empty, and her uniform still hung on the door like a ghost, but the crushing weight on her chest felt manageable. For the first time in 10 years, she felt like she could take a full breath without her ribs aching. She sat up and swung her legs over the side of the bed. Her feet touched the cold floor, sending a little chill up her spine, but she didn't shiver. She walked over to the small dresser and picked up the heavy envelope she had placed there the night before. It was the tips she had collected. She had counted them before going to sleep, but she needed to check again. She slid the bills out onto the bedspread. There were the hundreds from Mr. Sterling and David, mixed with the smaller, crumpled bills others had left. It was more money than she made in 2 months. It was enough to pay the rent. It was enough to buy a new coat. It was enough to fix the leaky faucet in the bathroom that had been dripping for 6 months. Hannah stared at the money, her fingers trembling slightly. It wasn't just currency, it was validation. It was the world telling her that she had value, not because she could serve a steak or clean a spill, but because she had shared her soul. She carefully put the money back into the envelope and hid it in her sock drawer. She dressed slowly, taking her time with the buttons on her blouse. She didn't feel the usual rush of anxiety. When she arrived at the bistro for the lunch shift, the atmosphere was different. It was the middle of the week, so the lunch crowd was mostly business people on their phones, but the energy of the place had shifted. The air felt cleaner, as if the music from the night before had scrubbed the walls clean of the old, stale negativity. Hannah walked into the kitchen to clock in. The head chef, a man who usually barked orders like a drill sergeant, looked up from a pot of soup. He looked at Hannah, then looked down at his clipboard. He didn't yell. "Heard you caused a scene last night," he grunted, though his voice lacked its usual bite. "Just played the piano, chef," Hannah said, tying her apron strings behind her back. "Good," he said, stirring the soup. "Maybe people will stop complaining about the food and start listening to the music. Get to work. Table 4 needs water." It wasn't a hug or a congratulation, but coming from him, it was a royal decree of respect. Hannah smiled to herself as she tied her apron. Throughout the lunch rush, Hannah noticed something else. The other servers looked at her differently. Lisa, the young girl who usually ignored her, came up to her while they were waiting for orders. "My dad called me this morning," Lisa said, leaning against the counter. "He was here last night with his new girlfriend. He told me about you." Hannah paused, folding a napkin. "Oh. He said he cried," Lisa said, shaking her head in disbelief. "My dad never cries. He said he hasn't heard anything that beautiful since his mother died. He said I should be lucky to work with you." Hannah felt a warmth spread through her chest. She looked at Lisa, really looked at her, and saw a young woman who was just trying to figure life out, just like Hannah had been at that age. "He was very kind," Hannah said softly. "We are all just trying to get by, Lisa." "I didn't know," Lisa admitted. "I thought you were just, old. Quiet." "I am old and quiet," Hannah laughed gently. "But I have a lot of noise inside me." Lisa smiled, a genuine smile that reached her eyes. "Well, anytime you want to let the noise out, I'm listening." By the time the dinner shift started, the word had spread. The bistro was busier than a usual Tuesday night. People weren't coming for the food, they were coming for the vibe. They had heard the rumors about the Waitress pianist. They sat in the corner, looking at the piano with anticipation, hoping she would play again. Hannah moved through the tables, taking orders and refilling glasses. She was calm. Efficient. She felt like a lioness moving through the grass, confident in her own skin. She wasn't hiding anymore. About halfway through the shift, the manager came out of his office. He was a short man who usually stayed in the back, counting money. He walked over to the center of the room and clapped his hands. The conversation died down. "Attention, everyone," he said, looking nervous. "We have a small treat tonight. As some of you know, last night was quite special for us. We realized that we have a hidden gem among our staff." Hannah stopped dead in her tracks. She was standing near the service station. She looked at the manager, her eyes wide. "No," she thought. "Please don't make a scene." "Hannah," the manager said, waving her over. "Come here, please." The room erupted in polite applause. Hannah felt the blood rush to her face. She walked over to him slowly. She wasn't afraid this time, but she was hesitant. She didn't want to be a spectacle. She didn't want to be a trick. "Can you play something for us?" the manager asked. "Just one song. People are asking." Hannah looked around the room. She saw Mr. Sterling sitting in his usual spot, raising his glass. She saw the young student from the night before, sitting with a notebook open. She saw empty tables where people like David had sat, people who judged without knowing. But mostly, she saw faces that were open. Faces that were waiting. She looked at the piano. It stood there in the corner, silent and waiting for her. It wasn't a monster anymore. It wasn't a reminder of what she had lost. It was just a tool. It was a way to speak. Hannah nodded to the manager. "Yes," she said. Her voice was clear and strong. "I will play." The room quieted down immediately. Hannah walked to the piano and sat down. She adjusted the bench. She didn't feel the fear she had felt the night before. She didn't feel the desperation. She felt at peace. She didn't play Rachmaninoff this time. She didn't want to be sad again. She placed her hands on the keys and began to play a melody by Debussy. It was light, airy, and fluid, like water flowing over stones. It was Clair de Lune. The music floated through the room, gentle and sweet. It wasn't a performance of grief, it was a performance of healing. As her fingers moved, Hannah realized she wasn't playing to impress anyone. She wasn't playing to prove them wrong. She was playing because she loved it. And that love was pouring out of her and filling the room. She saw people stop eating. She saw them close their eyes. She saw them hold hands across the tables. The music was touching them, just like it had the night before, but in a softer way. It was a lullaby for the weary world. When she finished the piece, the silence was brief and sweet. Then came the applause. It wasn't a shocked applause, it was a grateful one. They were thanking her for the gift. Hannah stood up and bowed. A small, simple bow. It wasn't the bow of a superstar, but it was the bow of a master. She didn't run away this time. She stood tall, acknowledged the applause, and then walked back to her station. She picked up her tray and headed to table 9. As she walked, she realized that her life wasn't defined by the tragedy of the past 10 years. It wasn't defined by the dirty apron or the tired hands. Her life was defined by what she could create. She had forced the critics to go silent, yes, but more importantly, she had silenced the critic inside her own head. She reached the table where a young family was sitting. A little girl looked up at Hannah with wide eyes. "Are you the piano lady?" the girl asked. Hannah smiled, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She set down the water pitcher. "Yes, sweetie," Hannah said. "I am. I want to play like that one day," the girl said. Hannah looked at the girl's small hands. She remembered being that young, full of dreams. She reached out and gently tapped the table with her finger, keeping a steady rhythm. "Then you must listen," Hannah said softly. "You must listen to the music inside you, and you must never let it go quiet. No matter what happens." "I won't," the girl promised. Hannah poured the water, her heart full. She turned and walked back into the flow of the restaurant. She was tired. Her feet hurt. But she was happy. She had survived the night. She had survived the critics. And now, finally, she was ready to live again.